Hello everybody and welcome back to Tartarian Tales number 79 from artofdino.com. And this one began with a synchronicity that was really cool. A couple days ago in the community folder I posted something relating to the Hollow Earth. I was diving into AI and kind of trying to get some visions for some Hollow Earth ideas and just things. And that was, again, like I mentioned many times, that was the name of my first band back in like 1996 or 95, a couple months after I got a guitar. And our first song, the first song that ever launched me into songwriting officially, was called The Comet. So the next day after posting that Hollow Earth, I came across a book called The Comet, written by an anonymous Tartar. And so this is a really wild reading, and especially when you consider this. I read it first and then I went to the end, and when I got to the end, I found this page, which says, "The foregoing rhapsody was discovered last week by the coroner for Middlesex in the cell of a private asylum at Hoxton, where the use of pen and ink is allowed on a new theory of cure to harmless patients. It is offered to the public rather as a psychological curiosity than as a test of the system." The notes by the editor go on to say, "Public discrimination must decide whether the Bedlam system so graphically described by Madge Wildfire, I'm not sure who she is, as Merry Whips, Ding Dong, and Fasting Plenty, might not have proved a better restorative to the comet-bitten indicter of the preceding pages, or whether, failing coercion, he might not have been more effectually soothed by poppy or mandragora, or all the drowsy syrups of the East, acetate of morphine, or the daily perusal of the Morning Herald, than by the cultivation of his disordered faculties." So, I had to tell you that at first, because you have to keep it in mind that this was written by someone in an asylum. However, it was a Tartar in an asylum, so I feel like that is very relevant to all of us, and factoring that in, you know what asylums were as well. They were there to basically weed out the people who were thinking differently and thinking clearly, I think. So I personally think this guy's perspective is amazing and right on the money, and what he says is awesome, and I don't think that he's a crazy person at all. I think the world around him was crazy, and he saw it, and he put it down to words in a really beautiful way. Very, again, relevant to today. And it's very interesting because it's during the time that a comet was passing. So, very interesting the way people reacted, the way civilization reacted, and the way things just went haywire as a result of this, and especially how the media made it all go haywire, and the people in power definitely kept it going and exploited it to every end, which is what we know happens today. So you decide for yourself whether this guy is a loon or he is normal, but I think he's more like us, and he's, again, an anonymous Tartar. So we know he came from a civilization, again, that was lost, and in the first paragraph it explains it beautifully. So take what you will from this. I'm going to read the first 30 pages because it kind of flies by and it's very nicely written. So enjoy, and definitely check out the rest of the book as well. And again, these Tartarian tales are just here to really expose you to all the different, or as many different aspects of this whole Tartarian history that we can possibly find. Each one offers a different bit of insight, and so I hope you guys take it for what it is. Enjoy. Here we go. So right off the bat, this gets very interesting and telling. So it says, "The Comet, Melbourne, United States, December 4th, 1887. Which is interesting because I thought the book was published in 1857, so I don't know what I don't know what to think about this book. But either way, again, enjoy. Here we go. "Reluctantly and not without compunction do I accede, my dear children, to your wish that before the impression fades altogether from my mind, I should jot down a few of the incidents I have verbally related to you concerning the fatal epoch which, 30 years ago, destroyed the results of 8 centuries of civilization. I shall welcome the memories of that solemn time as they come unbidden to my recollection, grave or gay, lively or severe. year. I was a young man then and saw things in a far less thoughtful spirit than I should appreciate them now. So this might be just him kind of writing about what he's writing about what he remembered 30 years ago from the time when the comet came. So that makes a little more sense. So here we go. Check this out. But I love that how he says 30. I hate that, but how he says 30 years. It took 30 years for them to undo 8 centuries of civilization. And we know how easily it's possible. Basically, that is the reset right there. 857 to 880 something. This guy claims it. So here we go. Take a listen to this because this just is a mind boggler. To place the events I have to record distinctly before you, let me briefly remind you that Queen Victoria was on the throne, surrounded by a healthful, happy family, the elders of whom were on the verge of maturity, that the Emperor of the French, blessed with a handsome wife and promising son, was gradually overcoming by much prodigality of the public money and no small expenditure of claptrap, the prejudice excited by his fantastic antecedents and equivocal lineage. The apostolic mission of pacificator of Europe, assumed by Louis Napoleon, had thrown over his political tyrannies the mantle which is said to cover a multitude of sins. This guy's got a great perspective. Spain and Italy were in their normal state of insurrection. Germany was writhing with inefficient vivacity like a dismembered snake, the fractions of which seem almost always darting about in search of a head. The rest of Europe was somewhat hazy, for unexpected interalliances among the greater powers rendered the duodecimo sovereigns uneasy on their thrones. As to America, it is difficult to speak appropriately of a country, the slang or chaff of whose public press renders it doubtful whether their jokes be earnest or their earnest a joke. So wow, the media has been dog crap forever in America. But the Stars and Stripes had been recently going ahead at the rate of 50 knots an hour, had distanced the, quote, old folks at home in the manufacture of history, novels, and yachts, as well as of pumpkin pies, had beheld sea serpents while we saw only earthworms, had held converse with the world of spirits as familiarly as Europe gossips with a crossing sweeper, and could drive 40 horses in hand, though our London Driving Club could scarcely manage 4, while the rhythm of her melodies and poetry charmed the ear of the venerable mother country, which makes bargains of her India rubber overshoes in fun of her legation. So that is a packed paragraph on page 5. I recommend reading that again because it's very telling, and it just shows that they were just manipulating the public with just tales, fairy tales, while reality is a totally different beast. So here we go. Throughout the British Islands, peace was so recent a blessing that the olive had usurped the place of the laurel as the popular garland. Yet scarcely had we recovered our hoarseness after huzzaying home the Crimean heroes, when, with remarkable consistency, we hooted the peace party from the hustings, by which the new Parliament lost several what are called practiced debaters, i.e. so practiced in most cases that to the great detriment of public business they do nothing but debate. Oh, pretty much exactly similar to today. It was a singular house of assembly. The cry of the constituencies at the recent elections had been, "No lawyers," and to the nimble-tongued and hard-headed QC had succeeded the lisping lordling or vulgar tradesman. Many a parish vestry would reject the oratory of the tailors, haberdashers, gardeners, brewers, potters, who without a letter H in their united alphabet had attached to their names those of MP, the sellers of silk gowns having carried the day against the wearers of them. And remember, so he's referring to 1850s, 1856-7 when the comet came. Another loud and efficient cry was electoral reform. The masses wanted to be represented, i.e. the masses chose that each of their most sweet voices should be worth its guinea or guineas. Experienced men, however, were of opinion that the first electoral abuse to be reformed was the parliamentary agent, the man who keeps in his pocket a tariff of the consciences of the British Empire. If betting offices were abolished as immoral, why should parliamentary agencies be exempt from penal law? But the state of public morality was universally at a low ebb. The growth and diffusion of luxury had engendered exorbitant speculation. In the commercial world, crash succeeded crash, and godless worshippers of Mammon were snatched from banquets in opera boxes to the bankruptcy court or penitentiary, till the probity of the British merchant, long proverbial, became a jest. Literature was at a low ebb, In the sunshine of universal education, millions of ephemeral writers had sprung to light, but as the overdressing of a parterre produces leaves instead of blossoms, in the multitude of our authors was anything but wisdom. Again, sounds like today. Popular poets seemed to aspire to the strait waistcoat rather than the tunic of Apollo, and for works of fiction, readers were so hard to find that novels were served up to them in portions, illustrated by pictures like slices of unwholesome twelfth cake enhanced by characters. One or two remarkable historians and discerning critics stood high above the crowd, but the faces of the latter were as closely veiled as that of the Diana of the Ephesians, while the former, like the statues of great men usually set up in England, were so bespattered with mud by hands profane that their lineaments were scarcely distinguishable. And this is describing the reset. This comet basically, and all this time period, was the reset. This is how it happens, and soon in generations nobody has a clue what happened before. I'm very surprised that they even published this. But here we go. The arts, too, were under a cloud. The most popular artist was a first-rate painter of third-class subjects. In portrait, a few feeble-handed amateurs had pushed the RAs from their stools, while the pictures best adapted to the size of English houses and predilections of English minds were perverted by mannerism and affectation. For this we were indebted to the rhapsodies of a writer whose eloquence, gaudy as the promiscuous overflow of a color box, had burst like a deluge over the public taste, an explosion of verbosity full of foam and fury, signifying nothing, or worse than nothing. I'm not sure if they're talking about Shakespeare or who they're talking about there, but it could be. Of sculptors, the less said, the better. When a public monument was in request, a foreigner was sure to be selected for its execution, and the tomb of a British princess, bespoken by a British queen, bore on the plinth the name of an alien. Pictorial art of inferior character, as diffused by woodcuts and photographs, had obtained great popular influence. It was formerly proverbial that those who run may read, but people who travel at railroad speed are only able to instruct themselves by pictures. The two most popular journals, for the Times was more than a newspaper, one of the unanointed sovereigns of modern Europe, were Punch and the Illustrated News. But though the wit of the one and intelligence of the other was eminently remarkable, few readers perused more than the plates. High art enjoyed, of course, its fits and starts of patronage as well as low. The rich and great took a craze for refining the mind of the nation instead of preparing it for refinement. In a way went the lords and millionaires to work, sowing their Honiton sprigs upon hopsack. The industrial exhibition of 1851 projected chiefly with a view to the improvement of our manufacturers. Having fully succeeded in a mercantile and moral point of view, it seemed impossible to have enough of a good thing. And lo, the miraculous structure of the Crystal Palace, which had no fault but that in summer it could not keep out the sun, or in winter the rain, was both perpetuated and emulated, a mart for the busy idleness of lounging London. When, like all overgrowths, this monstrous excrescence of civilization began to languish, even the patronage of the court was propitiated with a view to invigorate its decline. Of the Mother Church, I would fain speak reverently, carefully disconnecting it from the holy cause of religion. I like that. But history will inform you how petty feuds and schisms, arising from ritual innovation, had originated childish altercations concerning church embroideries and sing-song, disgusting to those who profess the humility and simplicity of the primitive faith. At a time when men were looking for doctrinal enlightenment, they found their officiating priests squabbling over the texture of an altar cloth, or the twang, more or less nasal, that became the reading desk. And in these miserable dissensions, the name of God was only too frequently taken in vain. So similar to today. It's the same. You can see how today was set up via this description here. Still more injurious to the church was the custom of converting into spiritual lords men, however ghostly, whom excess of years had previously converted into the deaf, the halt, and the blind, so that superannuation was at hand. Like the showman in Dickens's novel who would not mend his broken puppets by the wayside, lest his kings and queens should forfeit their dignity in the public eye, it was even found necessary by Queen Victoria's Fourth Parliament to darn the lawn sleeves in private by the creation of a half-pay episcopate for decayed bishops. It cannot, however, be said that either the national church or public piety was in the decline. Most of our cathedrals and chapter houses were in process of restoration, and new places of worship rose on every side, till, by whatever road you approached the metropolis, the suburbs seemed to bristle with spires. Very interesting. So they were still using the tech. The press, that greatest of the great powers of Europe, which in England assumes the easy attitude of the Pharnacian Hercules, able to give a knockdown blow to an elephant, yet jauntily holding in his hand the golden apples. Wow, that guy's great. Was becoming a little tame in its jurisdiction, like the chorus of a Greek tragedy, owing and eyeing at every instance of monster swindling, wife-beating, or domestic poisoning, but without suggesting a remedy, or striking up I.O. peons for victories or triumphs, political, military, literary, or juridical, which it wanted the sagacity to foresee as soon as they became des faits accomplis. But its valiancy was gone. Neither press nor pulpit had courage to lay a finger on the sores of the century. It was patent to all mankind that selfishness, wantonness, and luxury prevailed on every side. The corruptions of Babylon and Jerusalem, Nineveh and imperial Rome were emulated in London and Paris, yet no prophet denounced, no juvenile scourged, no, the miserable offenders, no John Knox, no Bossuet, no Nathan dared to say, "Thou art the man." Even the government, which dispatched a photographic apparatus to the King of Siam and court dresses to the Marquesa Islands, allowed the sewerage of the metropolis to become a joint stock bank of disease in one of the finest of navigable rivers, in Acheron. The enormous population of our titanic city was supposed to have overgrown all legislative wisdom. Like Frankenstein, we had created a monster from whose malignancy and strength we were forced to flee. Just everything's degrading from how it was in the past, and this guy was around at the time where he watched all this. No wonder why they considered him insane, because he was pissed at what the world was doing. Such, my children, was the state of the nation. When the first whisper arose of its coming condemnation, some German astronomer announced from his observatory on the Elbe or Spree that a new comet had become visible. A rival stargazer instantly contended that the new comet was an old acquaintance, the very one which startled the earth at the abdication of Charles V, and wise and foolish fell to crying down the comet as though it were a poor old used-up luminary, not worth mentioning. So remember how the decline was happening. Remember that description, because now the comet comes, and wait till you see how the world reacts. Here we go. In scientific circles, many a learned pundit discussed the matter as familiarly as if in the confidence of Providence. In the public institutes of several foreign capitals assembled to pronounce judgment on the great phenomenon, with an audacity worthy those incorporated duncehoods, which attach the riband of 50 orders of merit to their buttonhole, and the initials of 50 learned societies to their name. But what is called the world cared very little about the matter. Tidings from the aforesaid privileged owleries reached it through occasional paragraphs in a highly respectable periodical called the Athenaeum, one of those publications which it was said by Charles Lamb that no gentleman's library should be without, and which for a quarter of a century consequently lay uncut on every gentleman's library table, propaganda. But it was not for many months after Paris had named a new silk, new parasol, new inkstand, and new steamer after the comet that it afforded a topic for polite conversation. Thenceforward, it was treated with the levity which is perpetually attempting to rarefy the dense atmosphere of fashionable life. The comet which is to destroy the earth. Do you know there are people who really believe we are all to be consumed by fire about the middle of June? Were phrases in familiar use among those who venture to say everything because they know nothing. Again, this stuff, they've continued the same exact playbook up until today. This morning, they're still doing it. Von Littrow, the eminent German astronomer, endeavored meanwhile, by a judicious letter in the Vienna Gazette, to maintain his phlegmatic countrymen in their normal state of composure, by assurances that even if the comet of 1857 proved to be identical with those of 1264 and 1556, the planet we inhabit would incur no manner of danger from its reappearance in the heavens, since it could not approach us nearer than 5 million miles, keeping a distance 19 times greater than that of the moon. but Professors Hind of London, Hoke of Leyden, Carlina of Milan, and Valls of Marseille each promulgated a contradictory theory, the most comforting of which, to the minds of the illiterate, was the assertion that even if compelled to pass through the tail of the comet, nay its very body, we should be very little inconvenienced by the transit. These luminaries, so dreaded by the ancient world, being as little solid or coherent as the creed of a modern politician. By one learned professor, comets were described as agglomerations of small corpuscles with considerable interstices, calculated to yield and give way to the impetus of any foreign body, as readily as an act of parliament or bill in chancery to that of a sharp legal practitioner. This guy's great. Had Professor von Littrow spent his life like Jemmy Boswell of immortal memory, faisant que de la comète, he could not have spoken more intimately of the nature and substance of these granulated astral impostors, these flash stars shining 5 millions of miles off, and since the astronomical Jesuit Father Schall obtained, by his prediction of an eclipse from the own brother of the moon, the renowned Emperor Chengche of the Manchu dynasty, the appointment of president of all that concerns celestial literature, the bold Viennese astronomer ought certainly to have received the knighthood of the Lion in the Sun. Very interesting again how they prop up Neil deGrasse Tysons and Bill Nyes. Whoever the government wants that will say whatever they want is who they get. Here we go. Madame de Savine, in one of her wise and witty letters of the year 1661, observes to her daughter, "We have here a comet, a prodigiously fine one, with the longest tail that ever was seen. All our august personages are in a panic, convinced that heaven, exclusively occupied with their affairs, has dispatched this comet to them as a harbinger of evil. I am told that Cardinal Mazarin, having been apprised by his physicians that his end was approaching, was further assured by his flatterers that a great comet had appeared in the heavens to announce the terrible event. The last effort of his life was a laugh at their expense, while he assured them that the comet did him infinitely too much honor. I am quite of his opinion. Human arrogance takes a little too much upon itself in supposing that the heavenly bodies have nothing better to do than trouble themselves with their births, deaths, or marriages. Our business, however, is not with the omens conveyed by the comet of the Grand Monarch, but with that of the British Queen. In June 1857, the weather became suddenly delicious. Genial days, auspicious nights. Never had the summer sky appeared more cloudless. Never had the nightingale sung so sweetly. Never had the foliage been so rich or flowers so abundant. The roses blew a week before their time. Idlers in the parks exclaimed, "We are indebted for all this to the comet." And gray-headed Epicureans confided to each other over the claret which their jaded palates had ceased to enjoy, glowing anticipations of the comet wine of 1857 as they hoped to taste it in 1865. Daring speculators on the future, for what were they reserved? A week later, in the heat of the weather became excessive. It was the moment when, because our fields, woods, and gardens were in their prime, it was the custom of the higher classes to flock to the metropolis in order to test their respirative powers in crowded rooms, theaters, and public assemblages by an atmosphere rivaling that of the Black Hole of Calcutta, which I'd like to look into. But where the thermometer stood in former seasons at 80, it now rose to above 100. Many venerable chaperones were carried off by apoplexy or pneumatic disorders, and more than one aged member of the upper house became comatose from congestion. They've always been old. The ones in government have always been elders. In fashionable chapels, hartshorn was in continual demand for fainting ladies, and parish churches were nearly deserted. The theaters advertised new ventilators instead of new pieces, kind of like the one near me that advertises new chairs for 5 years instead of the movies. It's pathetic. The 2 opera houses were still frequented, but the costume adopted, both on and off the stage, approached to the nude. If the heavy coifs and partlets and ruffs and robes fitting to the wrist and chin of medieval belles were entailed on them by open lattices and chimneys through which the winds of heaven buffeted their fair frames, plate glass and arnett stoves, listed doors and carpeted floors had enabled them to throw off a considerable amount of superfluous garments and exhibit a redundance of charms. But now, alas, it could scarcely be predicted where the disrobing was to stop. Well, that's at least a benefit, kind of. But though diverse old women, both in ermine and brocade, suffered fatally from the exacerbated temper of the climate, its influence proved, in some instances, highly advantageous. The listlessness produced by affectation became more listless than ever, but the listlessness arising from languid circulation of the blood was warmed into energy. A few dreary millionaires became almost lively. Several cold painters glowed into genius. Indigenous operas were announced, indigenous symphonies performed. Lyrics and sonnets full of fire were poured into the periodicals, till it became almost necessary to place insurance plates on their covers, and the new speaker had need to have possessed as many eyes as Argus to be caught by the legion of new orators contending for the ear of the house, all as suddenly inspired with eloquence as Balaam's ass. By degrees, excitement and exaltation became heightened into disease. Nay, doctors and apothecaries took care, as in most public emergencies, to improvisate a few new diseases suitable to the occasion. Wow, God, nothing changes. Compound names were invented for various forms of cutaneous irritation produced by the heat, and nostrums devised and advertised for their alleviation. Unguents and lotions, decoctions of cucumber and succory, or embrocations of coconut oil. Blank walls, instead of being placarded as formerly with Warren's Blacking or Tri-Turner, bore notices to the public to mollify their parched cuticle with Dr. Darge's liquid marrow, or Sir Jacob Jollop's patent-absorbent millen seed flour. Ordinary cosmetics were no longer in demand. Photographic painting superseded on the faces of fashionable Jezebels rouge végétal and carmine, and many persons of susceptible epidermes were forced to anoint themselves like Hottentots. Still, except in country towns, the spinster coteries of Brighton and the Senior United Club, no serious alarm prevailed. People laughed off their sufferings as though they constituted a fashionable epidemic. The prevailing malady, disagreeable enough, but thank goodness it could not last long. An additional grant of 20,000 something L was voted for the better ventilation of the Houses of Parliament, and as the unsavory smells of the metropolis were such as to induce a belief that glue manufactories had been set up in every street, a supplementary board of health was hastily established. That must have smelled nasty. Professors with Davy's lamps in their hands and suspirators on their lips crept sniffing through the subways of the city, but all ended in the asphyxiation of one of the rash Quintus Curtiuses who had leapt into the public sewers. I can't imagine what the underground of London is like. I've never heard much about it, but it must be ridiculous and elaborate and nasty. Families of independent means took refuge in their shady country seats, in the villas and suburban retreats advertised to be let in Mr. Alfred Cox's list of miniature paradises, rose in value cent per cent. The German baths overflowed prematurely. Even English bathing places were enabled by putting up thousands of panting citizens to take down their bills. But it was all in vain. It was found that the steely expanse of the stagnant ocean reflected back the heat with fiercer intensity than even the scorched inlands. So long as human nature abideth, every crisis, however terrible, will give rise to sordid speculation. Those whose pleasure grounds could boast of grottos doubled their rent. In the caves of Cleefton, Cockenhall, and Clifton rose to a premium. A joint stock company was formed to convert the Castleton Cavern and Pool's Hole into fashionable retreats. Another established a succession of monster steamers for transatlantic navigation to import blocks of Wenham ice. Our British ice houses from John O'Groat's house to the Land's End, having, unlike the British Bank, long been in a solvent condition. A far more alarming failure, however, was soon bruited about, which filled every mind with consternation. The wells of the United Kingdom were becoming arid as its speeches from the throne. This is where the water started to become terrible. That's me. But here we go. That humid, verdant country, whose moisture and herbage used to be proverbial throughout the world, was converted into a barren and dry land where no water is. For weeks, no rain had fallen, nor a cloud been perceptible. A sandy desert was around us. Even such moist localities as the fens of Lincolnshire and Cambridge, the marshes of Essex, and the half-drained crown lands called Royal Forests, whose aborigines are said to be web-footed, interesting, might be walked over dry shod. The very rivers ran so shallow in their beds that the Thames was crossed upon stepping stones at Putney and at Tewkesbury the Severn. The water companies of London had long trebled their rates, that is, the Chelsea and Grand Junction, for the new river was in the Gazette. a convocation of the principal brewers of the metropolis to create a proportionate rise in malt liquor, but even at the fabulous price set upon it, the increased consumption of brown stout could not be met by hundreds of thousands of hogsheads. Milk, the pastures and pumps being dried up, had become a more costly luxury than wine. Mercenary adventurers were not wanting to turn these deficiencies to account. To attract the languid public attention, our newspapers filled their columns with appalling intelligence connected with the atmospheric phenomena which overcame us like anything but a summer cloud. The word comet was in every mouth, terror in every heart. Wherever thermometers or barometers could be hung up, in sun, in shade, in shop windows, under awnings, in public buildings, or in public conveyances, these alarming monitors superseded city lists or royal bulletins, because they create fear. The great news of the day was no longer a Circassian victory or crash of China, but the fall of 1/4 of a degree in the mercury, which constituted our criterion of life or death. Sounds like the beginnings of global warming to me. When some selfish lord of the Admiralty proposed in the teeth of finesse a new Arctic expedition, everybody volunteered for the recovery of Sir John Franklin, dead or alive. By a beneficent general order from the Horse Guards, field days and summer drills had long before been remitted to a more convenient season. Now, slops of Irish linen and canvas were served out to cavalry in line. In aristocratic houses, carpets were replaced by brown holland, in those of less account by tralours matting. The touch of woolen had become obnoxious. Many trades were already as obsolete as during the prevalence of the plague. The publishers, for one. Where was the use of producing books which no one had stamina to read? A few catchpenny volumes on judicial astrology or the use and abuse of comets were sold in gay bindings at the railway stations, but great books were abolished as a great evil. Long-winded writers like Allison or Warren were laid on the shelf, and the colons and semicolons of the prolix fell into disuse. The curtest writers became popular. A 95th edition of Tupper's Proverbial Philosophy was said to be in the press. Short sentences, even when meaningless, carried the day. An enterprising city publisher attempted editions of Robinson Crusoe in the History of England in words of one syllable, after the manner of cobwebs to catch flies. But though John was a weak king, looked well enough in type, Vic was the best of queens, had an air of perked abbreviation, all but disloyal. People weren't buying it. Serials were discontinued and as entailing too severe a strain on the memory, and those periodicals whose laborious liveliness used formerly to emulate that of the industrious fleas now teemed with short sermons that might have passed for detached chapters of Law's Serious Call. Our faces grew longer and longer, our words, written or spoken, proportionately brief. In what need of fiction when the realities of life supplied such startling facts? Munchausen is a tame narrator compared with the daily journalists of 1857. Paragraphs of domestic intelligence passed almost unnoticed which, only a few months before, would have been mistaken for extracts from the Louisville Recorder in the U.S. or for the canards of a petite journal. So America was always pumping out trash, it seems like, and this is about the time when Britain started pumping out dump news. We were told one day that the date trees in the palm house of Kew Gardens had shot up 20 feet in 2 months and were now in full bearing. The next, that the fragile roofing of the Chatsworth Conservatory, having been necessarily removed to make way for the expansion of the tropical plants, so far from suffering by exposure, they were in a brilliant state of effervescence. The Amherstia exhibited growing racemes 3/4 of a yard in length, ripe. Bananas were dropping from their stems, and the Strelitzia was darting forth 1,000 fiery tongues. To this glorious spectacle, uniting the beauties of both hemispheres, the varied flora of the prairies and gigantic vegetation of the Himalaya, all such florists as had animal strength for the effort flocked in crowds. But as if to attest the theory of compensations, Chatsworth, in attaining a new attraction, lost one of its former charms. Its fountains were dry as a visitation sermon or Bridgewater treatise. In continental countries, the natural phenomena produced by the crisis assumed a more terrible character, while in the two Sicilies, the lava of Etna and Vesuvius fused forth like the heroics of Balder in Switzerland. The eternal snows of the mountain and ice of the glaciers, in process of liquefaction, were pouring torrents into the valleys. Mont Blanc, the monarch of mountains, had lost his majestic crest. The lakes overflowed. Hundreds of villages were submerged. The public traffic of Geneva was carried on in boats, the inhabitants having retreated to the upper stories of their houses. The manufacturers of the city were utterly destroyed, except as regarded dull politics and dreary metaphysics. The citizens of the pedantic republic still adhered to their privilege by putting forth essays on the nature and properties of comets, heavy enough to suspend the diurnal motion of the earth. In our own country, the Agricultural Society alone continued to need unleavened essays. Tip-tree farmers and other torturers of the earth's surface were in the highest state of excitement. The world seemed all before them where to choose their ground for experiments. All was a waste. Since our first parents were driven into a region of sand and briars, since Coke, of Holklam, regenerated with patent plows the wilds of Norfolk, never had theoretical agriculturists had such a chance of exploitation. The exaltation produced in the month of June by the unexampled prospects of the harvest was nothing to that which arose when the teeming land was found to be parched into utter desiccation. Empty ears of corn supplied only chaff, and the coriaceous stalks were brittle and valueless, even as straw. In India, in Egypt, in China, such contingencies of weather are provided against by careful irrigation. Ancient techniques that continue to work better than anything. That's me adding. In England, the rainy season is supposed to be a permanent institution. Well, that didn't work. And that's, I think, what a lot of the more modern people relied on. That is one of the main differences, again, between the ancients and now. Nowadays, they have a terrible outlook on things and nothing is really done properly. Back then, they were in harmony with nature and things worked. Okay, here we're going. But the experimental farmer was not the only miscreant that glorified in the catastrophe. The Israelites, who from the same time Joseph's brethren sold him into captivity, have seldom shrunk from a remorseless bargain, having bought up with cunning foresight from every corn mart, garner, or granary the means of human sustenance, commanded the food market. Yikes. Our flocks and herds were perishing. Pulse was no longer in existence, unless, like the Negroes, we could imbibe a taste for the deglutition of earth. Famine was imminent. In the moment that word is pronounced, how searching the sensation, plague, cholera, yellow fever, typhus, any other epidemic admits hope of escape. But famine? To die the death of the shipwrecked in the Medusa, with desolate fields around us, in lieu of a waste of waters. To endure the fate of the besieged in Jerusalem and the soldiers in the Crimea. To behold our noble coach horses eat away each other's tails in our stalls in Mayfair. So this guy was very familiar with the Crimea and what happened there, and I guess the soldiers were starved out because of God knows what. But again, this is an anonymous Tartar, so he has a great rendition, and I find very similarities with him and us, because if things continue the way they're going, we all might end up in an asylum, because we speak the truth and the people out there hate that and fear it. So here we go, towards the end. Scarcely had the sentence gone forth when there appeared, placarded in every railway station, in the blank palings of every new church, the only public building still in progress, advertisements of Sawyer's Comet Dietary, consisting of recipes for dressing food, meat for man, now that meat was denied us, for making bread from sawdust, butter from spermaceti, unadulterated or rather unconcealed adulteration. Ascension Island had long supplied us with turtle as lean as ragged schoolboys, and in our lordly parks shadows of deer lying, wasted and shrunken, upon turf and under foliage, as crisp as fried parsley, foretold venison whose leanness might have placed an alderman in mourning. But what was this compared with a Barmecide's feast of deal boards and sperm oil? Sawyer, the modern Vattel, the popular inventor of fairy stoves and Sebastopolian banquets, interesting, need not have added insult to injury. Still, as during the awful visitation of the plague in the time of the Stuarts, marrying and giving in marriage, folly and frivolity were far from extinct. The same wanton class that habitually indulges in white-bait banquets at Greenwich or Blackwall, or devours maids of honor at Richmond or Hampton Court, made parties for the trial of Monsieur Sawyer's famine dainties. The few wet ditches extant in the neighborhood of the metropolis were ransacked for edible weeds and cresses to form salads a la COMET. Steamers were chartered for Greenland, Nova Zembla, or Iceland for cargoes of seabirds, eggs, ptarmigan, reindeer, and such other beasts of the field, or birds of the air as subsist on moss or lichen. The cafes and comestible warehouses of the Palais Royal were filled with strange meats. Even the most fastidious ceased to shudder. A horrible idea had been suggested by a popular dining-out man that we must not be too difficult in such matters, with cannibalism looming in the distance. Novelty, however, reconciles the blasé palate of the luxurious to many a nastiness. And have we not all learned from our copybooks that jucundum nihil est nisi quod reficit veritas, which means there is nothing pleasant but that which refreshes variety. So, wow, with that is the end of the first chapter, and there's about 60 more pages left of this book, so I definitely recommend checking out. I'll include the link below. This is a Google book that I found, but again, a synchronicity led to this, and I find it just incredibly interesting because it details a view of a Tartarian, which was, we know, an oppressed and kind of forgotten peoples, who's in an asylum telling about how he sees the world. And that kind of concludes with, the people in asylums definitely weren't always crazy. They were just considered crazy by the people in power, which is, again, what they do nowadays still. So all this stuff, again, any of us could be in this type of situation one day writing about what happened and how, COVID and everything led to a new revolution and how the whole world has changed and it become probably, if we lose the battle, it could become something completely different and unrecognizable again in another 10 or 5 or 20 year period. So again, we have to learn from everything that happens in the past, and especially this, because we just can't let this stuff happen. It's absolutely disgusting how the media, how everyone just, their search for profit and their quest for profit just sucks all the humanity out of all of them. And it wasn't the way things were in the past. Things were definitely much more fresh and honest and truthful and peaceful and amazing. And I also can't get out of my head that book, which I'm going to do in one of the newer episodes, how it mentioned that in Ethiopia people were living to 150 and 200 years old. It's just like, dear God, everything surrounding the British or the controllers and the masters of the reset, everything surrounding them just stinks. Everything they did to the world just stinks. And it's really absolutely a shame because they sucked all the magic and beauty and miracles out of this world and created something and worked really hard to create something that just is just not nearly as good. And it's what we've kind of all grown from, and it stinks. I want to get back to the magic and the divinity and the sacredness that Earth needs and has and wants to be utilized. So hopefully we can, knowing and learning and experiencing things and doing this and adjusting our lives properly is a way of doing it. So I hope you all enjoyed this. A little bit long for one of my Tartarian tales, but very excellent. Definitely check out the rest of the book, and bless you all.